Good evening, city councilors, staff, residents, guests, and welcome to Cedar Falls City Hall. I'm Rob Green, the mayor, and I will call this committee meeting to order. Our first item tonight is a capital improvements program update from Director Rodenbeck. If you could start.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, I do want to welcome we have some Planning and Zoning Commission members here tonight too, so we invited them to come listen as well. Obviously, the CIP, or Capital Improvements Program, you know, it's a collaboration with all departments, but what I'm going to do tonight is really just do an overview of the process. If there's detailed questions, obviously some people from departments can jump in, but just want to talk about the process and the financing. So the CIP is a planning document, and it doesn't authorize or fund projects. Funding of projects will be coordinated with the annual budget process. You'll see on the CIP that there's 217 projects for a total of over $307 million. And there's approximately 50 different funding sources. And you'll see as we go through some of the highlights what some of those sources are. Again, I just wanted to clarify that it is a planning document. I think oftentimes people will say, well, I saw it in the CIP, so aren't we doing it? And it is planning, which means it changes from year to year as priorities change. One of the things what we do when we're developing the CIP is to really take from council goal setting and kind of those gives us the parameters for the CIP. So some of those things are infrastructure maintenance, street, sewer, stormwater. At goal setting, we talked about what projects will be funded by our emergency reserve dollars. We also talked about what would be a goal for private donations for some of our projects. Also went through what our funding requests from gaming were, and you'll see those incorporated in the CIP. Also looked at user fees, you know, whether it's refuse, sewer, stormwater, that we do try to develop those fees to cover the capital projects too, not just the operating costs for those funds, but the capital as well. We base our general obligation funding on replacement debt, which means that as we retire debt each year, we do not try to sell more than what we retire, so we can keep that an even-keeled effect on our property tax levy. And we always, whoops, I skipped ahead. We always want to make sure that we maintain a debt strategy that protects at least 25 to 30% of our debt capacity. So those are kind of the financial parameters we use to develop the CIP. One of the things we also get asked oftentimes with the CIP is about quality of life projects. Obviously there's a lot of infrastructure on the CIP, but we get asked about quality of life projects. So there's approximately $14 million on the CIP. That's a small percentage, it seems, to that big number of $307 million. But keep in mind that usually quality of life projects are funded by general property taxes, hotel, motel, private donations. So sometimes that funding source is more difficult for quality of life projects. So the next thing I wanted to do was really just highlight 10 or 12 projects on the CIP. As we said, there's several on there, but at least want to get, you know, highlight at least some of the big projects. So what I've done is just put the number that it is on the CIP. So you can see the first few that are listed on the CIP are actually our industrial park and southern expansion, and you can see it's over multiple years. And these are things, you've already seen some presentations as it relates to the Creekside development. So some of these aren't new, but just wanted to let you know that they are things that we'll be doing in probably 3 to 5 phases. You know, it's going to take a while. It's also going to take a while in terms of cash flow as development. So there might be some things we'll have to cash flow in our TIF districts before the TIF revenue comes back in. Sustainability, or maybe here just talk about climate action plan, but sustainability. We do have it in the CIP for actually a few years, and what this CIP item, the $246,000 covers is hiring a consultant to develop a plan. Also covers the EV charger that we've put up, and also talk how we're going to do some energy efficiencies in our buildings. We're going to work with CFU to come look at our buildings and see how we can do some more energy efficient things. So that's what this CIP line item covers. By the way, I know we got a lot to get through tonight, Mayor, so I'm just gonna kind of keep rolling if that's okay. Number 31 and 34, parking lot improvements. I just wanted to point this one out. It's not a big one on the CIP, as you can see. It's only 500,000, but I shouldn't say only, but 500 compared to some of them. But why I would just want to bring it up is just remind people, you know, we did do a parking study, and we have some working committees with College Hill and Community Main Street. So Some of the things we did was actually go physically. Our committee went and walked around the parking lots to see what improvements need to be made. And so these are listed on the CIP. You'll see that the College Hill ones are actually in earlier years than the downtown ones, just based on the need for the improvements. So wanted to highlight that, and that will all come out of TIF funding in those two areas. Next project is our City Hall repurpose and remodel. You can see a timing of FY 20 to 22 with an approximate cost of $3 million. That's obviously, we're still in the early stages of doing some design. You know, what prompted this, of course, was police moving out to the new public safety building. And as we've been working with architects to develop this, there was obviously some things that were kind of the driving things that we wanted to look at. You know, what are some safety concerns, security concerns? Are there any accessibility concerns that we have? We want to try to address all of those as we're looking at remodeling the building. We also wanted to kind of look at, are there things that are more flexible work environments? Are there things that kind of provide more cohesiveness between departments in the building? And so those are some things that kind of are driving that project and the design for that. Next one on is number 50, the Hearst Center expansion. For those that have been around, you know that this has been listed for various years, and you'll see that we have $5 million listed as the funding, and you can see the variety of sources, whether it's general obligation bonds, gaming, cultural funds, grants, and of course the big one, the private funding. I know the Hearst Center, the Art and Culture Board, they've had a visioning committee, their you know, facility study by a consultant, and again, I think still trying to figure out where that's going to go, and probably come forward at some point to council about what the thought is on that. Number 55, Cedar River recreational improvements. I know this has had a lot of discussion about the project and also where the funding should come from. So you can see that's listed on the CIP at $4.1 million. General obligation bonds of $400,000, a gaming grant, and other grants of $1.9 million, emergency reserve dollars, which I mentioned earlier, of $1 million, private donations of $500,000, and hotel motel tax of $300,000. You know, again, this is one of those classic case at goal setting where council kind of helped set those parameters about what we're going to do in terms of private fundraising, what are we going to use for emergency reserve dollars. You know, obviously the big piece in this is the gaming grant, but also we might try for a cat grant and some other things to go with it. So I think there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle yet for this project, but obviously we're continuing to work on getting that incorporated. Number 89, Olive Street Box Culvert. Wanted to at least mention one stormwater project just because there are a lot of stormwater projects on the CIP. And you'll see the timing of 20 to 21 and a total project cost of $1.1 million. You also see that there's a share of stormwater funding and general obligation funding. Because we have a lot of projects, our stormwater fund is one that probably needs help in terms of funding, and so we have to use some general obligation bonds for some of our stormwater projects. Annual street repair program. Again, nothing new to Cedar Falls, but this is the local option sales tax that we collect every year, and we're up to about $5 million that we get each year. So this is the line item that talks about the resurfacing and reconstruction. You also note that there are other projects on the CIP that use loss funding, local option sales tax as well, so this isn't the only item. And they also, you'll see in this item is just some utility funding, whether it's sewer or CFU, because obviously as we're working on a street, if there's utilities that have to be repaired, we would do that at the same time. 123, Cedar Heights Drive reconstruction, timing of 20 to 22, a project cost of $6.9 million. It's from Green Hill to Viking and last constructed in 1983. We are getting, as you can see, a federal funding of $2.9 million for this project. Also just awarded the DOT grant for that project, but we'll be using our local option sales tax funding and our road use tax funding as well for this project. 131, Main Street reconstruction. Similar kind of thing, various funding. We have road use tax and local option sales tax funding. We'll be using some general obligation bond funding for some of the amenities that would go to this in terms of, whether it's improved intersection, complete street elements, those would be things that oftentimes we'll have to use general obligation bond funding for. 133 Ridgeway Avenue. So really just wanted to mention this because Phase 2, and it's in our new southern CF TIF district area. You will see that there was a piece of this that the developer had to pay for, so that's why I wanted to highlight this one. 140 West First Street. Again, this isn't a new project, but it's a project that most people know was going on, I guess. So obviously currently underway, hope to be completed by the end of 2021. $15 million project. Most of the costs are shared on a 50-50 split with the state. I can't talk. But so that's why you'll see the various funding there. A lot of it the state of Iowa funding. 147, but just included 146 and 130, the downtown streetscape. FY20 to 22, total project cost is $7.6 million. Downtown TIF funding will be paying for a big portion of that. We'll also have a gaming grant that we've asked for in 2 phases. This also has a private funding piece with Community Main Street. And why I included those other ones is because it's not only this item on the CIP, but it includes the brick replacement, the Peter Melendi Park renovation, so actually multiple things on the CIP with this project. 191, fire tank truck. This is scheduled for 21. It's really been in line for replacement. It was the truck chassis last time was 1992. The reason why I wanted to include this, it shows geo funding at $200,000, is just to kind of remind people that when we have big equipment ticket items, those are also things we're putting on the CIP and having to figure out funding for. So, oftentimes, again, we think of streets and sewer and stormwater, but there's the equipment piece we have as well. Lastly, just always want to highlight this project, I guess, because it's the biggest one on the CIP, but it's our nutrient removal. And it has on the CIP timing of 25. Those are things that we're still looking at, trying to figure that out. That's what prompted a lot of our discussion with the regionalization study. And I know at council, or at goal setting, there was a little bit of discussion about that, but obviously more about that will be coming as we know more about that process. Just also want to mention again stormwater projects. Already talked about that a little bit, but 14 projects on the CIP that use stormwater, or $3.6 million, and already talked about how we have to use GO funding to cover some of those projects. Hope is to complete 3 alleys per year. I know that's been a question in the past, and just a reminder that we did approve a 4-year rate increase a year ago, and obviously we're going to have to continue to monitor those rates as we continue to have projects in stormwater. Sewer is probably maybe even the more challenging one. 19 projects on the CIP that use sewer funding are $76 million. Again, a lot of it's because they're big ticket items, what makes it challenging. And we did approve a 3-year rate increase a year ago. And really what we're trying to do now with the CIP and the large bond sales, they'll continue to have an effect on rates, but really by setting our rates, we're trying to keep up so there's not a big, huge increase. In a few years, we're trying to kind of slowly build up that cash. So again, when we do have to do big projects, we don't have to majorly increase the rates. Also want to mention TIF projects that related to new South Cedar Falls TIF area and expand industrial. There are several projects related to our downtown TIF district and continue to have projects in our existing ones as well. Just a little bit lastly about funding. So sometimes people are interested. We focus a lot on general obligation bonds because that's what affects the debt levy. But you can see when you look at the revenue sources, that's actually just a small piece of the puzzle. So there's lots of other funding sources that go into the projects. And you can kind of see a breakdown there. I mentioned about our debt capacity. As you can see, that we're only using about 9 to 10% of our debt capacity, so really have no concerns about reserving that capacity, but it's always this, as we're developing the CIP, this is what we're making sure of, is that we are not increasing it, or, and again, that we're still reserving plenty of debt capacity in case we ever need it. We also take what is the effect of the CIP financially. And so as you saw, still very low use of our debt limit. The issuance of new bonds on the CIP shows a 1.7 increase in taxes over the next 5 years. And so this show, again, that's over 5 years, 1.7%. So that shows exactly what we were trying to do in terms of replacement debt, that we're trying to keep that steady. And we're also very conservative. You know, this assumes no growth in our valuation, so we're always being conservative when we do that. So lastly, just wanted to really kind of remind what the process is. So tonight, overview and any questions. We'll actually have the formal public hearing and consideration by council on January 20th. So if there's questions by anybody, you can still ask, you know, shoot me an email, give me a call, whatever, about any projects, because we'll be doing the formal process that night, and then we'll eventually incorporate the FY21 column into the budget. So there you go, Mayor, and so if there's any questions.
Thank you, Director Rodebeck. There's no action required, just to reiterate that for tonight, but I'll open it up for council for any questions or discussion. Okay, seeing none, I will move us to the next item on the agenda, which is a discussion of conflict of interest, ex parte communications, and the role of elected officials. This will be carried up by Christine Stone from Ehlers & Cooley, and I will have Attorney Rogers actually give us an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As you and council are aware, certain issues come up that council members face from time to time, and a couple of those are the prohibition against ex parte communication, as well as conflict of interest rules. We thought it would be beneficial to council for an outside attorney to come in and talk about those matters, get an outside perspective maybe. Also, we added this time a couple other items which we thought might be beneficial for new council members and existing ones as well, and that is the role of council as a group, and also some basic information about open meetings laws. Christine here is a well-experienced attorney advising elected officials all over the state, and so we're glad to hear from her.
Thank you, Kevin. Good evening, everyone. So as Kevin said, I'm an attorney with the Ehlers & Cooley firm in Des Moines, and I'm going to be going through kind of some big picture topics tonight. Feel free to ask questions. If anybody has questions that they're uncomfortable asking, you know, in a public setting, you can certainly contact me afterwards. Kevin has my contact information, so we are always available to help work through any questions that you might have. So this is just a standard disclaimer. Understand that any information I give you tonight is general in nature, and every specific situation is a little different. So if you do have, you know, real specific questions, you should contact Kevin, your city attorney, or, you know, I can always help with those as well. So as Kevin said, the topics that we're going to cover this evening are sort of the big picture of the City Council and the role of its members, conflicts of interest and what Iowa law provides regarding that, ex parte communications, and then a little bit on open meetings. And as I said, if you have questions, just feel free to jump in. So the Iowa Code does sort of establish the framework under which cities are organized. The powers of cities are vested in its city council, except as otherwise provided by state law. The Iowa statutes are very clear that there is no power that is vested in any individual council members. It's the body as a whole that is empowered to act on behalf of the city. There is one exception to that general premise, and that is for mayors. There are specific duties such as emergencies, administrative roles, sometimes supervisory powers that mayors have, and that can come from both state law and your local city code. But in terms of your council members, you know, those act as a body. Cedar Falls specifically operates under the mayor-council form of government. And that form of government, you are allowed to appoint a city manager and sort of identify the role and responsibilities of that person, which you have done in your city code. Under your city code, the mayor is the chief executive of the city and the presiding officer of the council, and you have established a framework which basically says that the council sets the overarching policies for the city, and the city administrator then implements those policies. The mayor has some specific powers within the city code. The mayor is empowered to supervise all the departments of the city and give direction to the department heads concerning the functions of those departments. The mayor has the power to examine all the functions of the city and their records and to call for special reports from the department heads at any time. And the mayor is also tasked with the role of directly supervising the city administrator. The mayor is responsible for the annual performance evaluation, and then that evaluation is available to the city council for review. So similarly, under your city code, you also have some direction given to the city council. The city council annually adopts broad goals, objectives, and program performance measures to guide the city administrator in the development of the budget, of the CIP, and the administration of city projects and programs. So there again, the city council is sort of the overarching policy maker who provides feedback and direction to the city administrator, who then implements those policies. This is directly from your city code again, which identifies the role of the city administrator. The city administrator is the chief administrative officer of the city, responsible to the mayor and city council for the management of all city affairs placed in his or her charge by city ordinance. So again, as council members, your authority and powers come from the actions that you take as part of the city council, not the actions that you might take as an individual. The council is responsible for establishing policy and direction, and then the implementation of that is left to the city administrator. And this framework comes from both state law as well as your local city code. So when you consider that sort of overarching framework, how is it that councils are able to work effectively? You must take action as a body. You have to work together to achieve common objectives. You have to identify a shared direction and set of goals. Then those goals and direction are provided to the city administrator in terms of policy direction. And then the city administrator's role is to implement the policies through the department heads and staff. Iowa law is clear that individual council members do not have the authority to implement changes themselves, policy changes individually. This creates confusion, there can be mixed messages, and it can also unfortunately create liability for both the city and in some circumstances for yourselves as well. There is case law that says that individual council members do not have the authority to bind the city in contract. So if a council member were to sign a contract, whether it's purchasing supplies, materials, or something more substantial than that, that's not an authorized action on the part of the council member, and that contract would be considered void. And then there's also case law that says if an officer, which a city council member is considered as an officer of the city, if an officer acts in bad faith or knowingly exceeds his authority, he may be held personally liable for damages. So as I said previously, you can be opening yourselves up to liability as well as that on the part of the city. So one of the examples as I was sort of preparing this presentation tonight that I found came from the Municipal League of Cities in Minnesota. And an example that they gave was a city council member had heard that there was a member of the city, an employee, who was routinely calling in sick to work but had another job on the side. And so that council member took it upon themselves to investigate and see whether this was in fact true, and followed this person and did see them working somewhere else when they were supposed to be on the clock for the city. The council member took it upon themselves, to fire the person on the spot. Obviously, this can cause problems because many city employees are covered by collective bargaining agreements and have other rights in terms of employment. So, sometimes your heart can be in the right place, but, it's just a question of, do you have the authority to be taking that action, and who is best able to do that? So that's sort of an extreme example, but one that I came across. So does anybody have any questions on that sort of preliminary issue? All right. So the next topic that we're going to cover is conflicts of interest, and this does come up from time to time. Conflicts of interest are defined in the common law, which is sort of the litigated cases that have developed over time, Iowa Code Chapter 362, Iowa Code Chapter 68B, as well as you have your own internal city policies that deal with conflicts of interest. So under the common law, the Iowa Supreme Court has stated that conflicts of interest rules, whether common law or statutory, are based on the moral principles and public policy. They demand complete loyalty to the public and seek to avoid subjecting a public servant to the difficult task of deciding between public duty and private advantage. So it's that conflict between your public duty to the city and your private interests in your private life that come into play and can cause the conflict. The Iowa Supreme Court has said that it is not necessary that the advantage be a financial one. Neither is there a requirement that there be a showing that the official sought or gained such a financial result. It's the potential for conflict of interest that the law desires to avoid. It is generally improper and illegal for a member of a municipal council or similar body to vote on any question in which he is personally interested or where his or her personal rights may be affected. So if there is a situation that is going to affect you personally, that's a conflict of interest and you should abstain and disclose the conflict right away. Additionally, under the common law, conflicts of interest can be found where a policymaker, which would be a council member in many circumstances, has an unalterably closed mind on matters that are critical to the disposition of the proceeding. Policymakers are required to consider in good faith, to objectively evaluate arguments presented to them, but you're not expected to be subjectively impartial. So you can bring your experiences to the dais when you're asked to, consider policies, but you are required to maintain an open mind and evaluate the arguments for and against certain policies as they come before you. Council members must therefore remain willing to consider opposing views on items which will come to you for consideration. You should be aware of potential conflicts and identify or disclose them in advance. Seek guidance early. Rarely are these issues black and white. It's usually, somewhere in between. And so, contacting the city attorney and talking through those issues can be very helpful in deciding how best to handle them. Turning to the statutes themselves, Iowa Code Section 362.5 says that a city officer shall not have an interest, direct or indirect, in any contract or job of work or material or the profits thereof or services to be furnished or performed for the officer's city. A contract entered into in violation of this section is void. So this can be referred to as sort of a self-dealing conflict where you're on both sides of the transaction, where it might be your business that is entering into a contract with the city. Like every good statute, there are exceptions, however, and there are more than just what I have included on the slide here, but these are sort of the most common ones that we see. So contracts that are publicly bid, there's no conflict if that's let through sort of the formal sealed bidding process where everyone is sort of on an even playing field. Contracts that might predate the election of the officer, so if someone's elected to office and they were, perhaps on a development team previously that had some sort of arrangement with the city, that's not a prohibited conflict of interest, but once they're now elected, they can't, renew that agreement or that can't be extended any longer. Contracts with a corporation in which a city officer has an interest by reason of stock holdings that are less than 5% of the outstanding stock, or if it's owned or controlled directly or indirectly by the officer or the spouse or immediate family member of such city. And then there are some others, as I said, that are contained in the statute. One thing that I like to point out is that the criminal code does make it a serious misdemeanor to have a direct or indirect interest in any contract to furnish anything of value to the city. So this type of conflict of interest is considered a crime. Serious misdemeanors are punishable by fine and imprisonment of up to 1 year. Iowa Code Section 362.6 gives members of the City Council the ability to determine whether a conflict exists for themselves, and this determination will be considered conclusive. So you're entitled to sort of make that call on your own behalf, whether you consider something to be a conflict or not. And if it is later determined to be a conflict and you still took action, the council's action as a whole will not be considered invalid due to the conflict unless the vote of that conflicted member was decisive to the passage of the measure. But remember, a contract will be considered void if the member had a prohibited interest in that contract. So even though the vote may prevail, the underlying contract itself may be essentially dissolved. Under Chapter 68B, there are also some prohibitions on city council members related to conflicts of interest. Council members are prohibited from engaging in any of the following conduct. There's 3 separate categories. The first is outside employment or activities that involve the use of the government's time or resources to give the person an advantage or benefit that's not available to the general public. The second category is outside employment or activities that involve the receipt or consideration by the government official from someone other than the government for performing work that is part of your official duties. And the third category is outside employment or activities that are subject to the official enforcement or control of the person during the performance of your official duties. So some sort of simplified examples of those would be the first category, as an example, using your city-provided iPad to run an online retail store. You're using the government resources to give yourself an advantage that's not available to others. The second category would be, as an example, accepting payment from a home builder each time you approve a residential subdivision plat for them. That's clearly receipt of consideration from someone other than the government for work that is part of your duties. And then the third example is owning and managing a bar that is within the city limits. So this would be subject to the official enforcement and control of the council in the liquor license context. So these conflicts are handled differently under the code. For the first and second category, you have to immediately stop the outside employment or activity. But for conflict number 3, however, you can either stop the outside employment or activity, or you can publicly disclose the conflict and avoid taking any action that would detrimentally affect or create a benefit for that outside employment or activity. Iowa Code Chapter 68B does extend certain conflicts of interest to elected officials' immediate family members. An immediate family member under 68B is defined as the spouse and any dependent children of a public official or public employee. So if you are prohibited from doing something, so are your spouse and dependent children. Cedar Falls does have its own city policy regarding conflicts of interests. There is an annual declaration of compliance that's required. The city prohibits its elected officials from engaging in any activity, practice, or act that unlawfully conflicts with or appears to conflict with the interests of the city. So this is consistent with the common law, which is the Wilson versus Iowa City case. And in that case, it said it is the potential for conflict of interest that the law desires to avoid. So when in doubt, disclose the conflict and do not take any action on the matter. By not taking action, that includes discussion. Some people think, well, I just can't vote, but I can talk about it. No, if there's a conflict of interest, you should not be trying to persuade other people to your point of view. You should not participate in the discussion either. Any questions about conflicts of interest?
If I may, Mayor.
Go ahead.
In regards to individuals making their own conclusions about a conflict of interest, if someone was to challenge that, what does that process look like, or is there a process for it?
So it would probably be some form of a legal challenge. Well, I guess there's two forms of challenge that could take. It could be an internal challenge amongst the council. So if the council felt like a particular council member was doing something inappropriate, there are ways that you can seek to remove a council member from office. The rest of the body can do that. But you know, it could be a taxpayer who's unhappy with some action that the city took and seeks to file a legal challenge to that. So, yeah, I would say it could go either of those directions.
Thank you.
And on slide 29, where it says elected officials are prohibited, I assume that includes appointed officials as well? All these
Yes.
prohibitions
So
apply.
officials of the city would include elected and appointed officials, correct?
Thank you.
All right. The next topic that we're going to talk about is ex parte communications. So really, when you talk about ex parte communications, you're talking about due process. Due process, as we all know, requires fundamental fairness, and you know, its basic form would be in a judicial proceeding. A trial that is fundamentally unfair violates the guarantees of due process under both the U.S. and the Iowa constitutions. So in the legal context, when we think of a typical trial, when a lawyer for one party communicates sort of secretively with the judge or juror in a manner that may influence the outcome of the adjudication, the other party has been deprived of its due process right to be heard. And the confidence in the public in the impartiality of the tribunal may be compromised. The Iowa Supreme Court has stated that the purpose behind the rule prohibiting ex parte communications is to prevent the effect or even the appearance of granting undue advantage to one party to the litigation. So these same basic principles apply to situations where a city council is performing a quasi-judicial function. Quasi-judicial functions are found where the activity involves proceedings in which notice and an opportunity to be heard are required, or where the council is making a determination of the rights of the parties, which requires the exercise of discretion in finding facts and applying the law thereto. So what does that mean? Some common examples of quasi-judicial proceedings in the city council context would be PUD rezonings, some other land use matters such as site plan approvals. License revocations are clearly quasi-judicial, so liquor licenses, pawn licenses, those types of things. Nuisance abatement actions, dangerous building actions, and then any and all appeals. So basically everything that goes to the Board of Adjustment is considered a quasi-judicial determination. So looking at zoning issues specifically, general zoning decisions, so rezoning, defining the zoning map boundaries, those types of things are considered legislative in character because the council is considering sort of the community at large and what is most beneficial to what makes most sense for the community overall. But some zoning decisions are a little more specific than that, such as PUD rezonings, where it's really sort of a contractual rezoning. If you're reviewing something where there's an application of design standards, so you have a set code that you're sort of looking at and evaluating and comparing that to what's been submitted for your consideration. And any situation where the council is called upon to review an interpretation and application of an ordinance. It can be difficult to draw this line, particularly in zoning matters. So sometimes it's better to err on the side of caution and avoid ex parte communications, maybe more so than you would in other contexts. At a minimum, due process requires that quasi-judicial proceedings involve notice, an opportunity to be heard, and an impartial decision maker. Ex parte communications can lead to one party being heard more than the other and/or can lead to a biased decision maker. and both of which of those situations would violate the due process rights of the parties to the dispute. So it's really about sort of equal time, equal opportunity to present to the city council, and then the council, making its decision based on that information rather than extraneous information that you might be hearing outside of the more formal council proceedings. There is some guidance that your city attorney provided back in 2007. That is an excellent summary of these concerns and issues. Ex parte communications should be avoided in quasi-judicial proceedings. If those communications do occur, they should be publicly disclosed at the formal council meeting to give both parties an opportunity to respond or object to that information so that everybody is informed about, what information the council is relying on as it makes its decisions. Outside of ex parte communications, there are some other sort of prohibited communications that council members should keep in mind. Any attorney-client privileged communications, so any legal advice that's given by your city attorney or outside legal counsel, that privilege can be waived if one party discloses the information to somebody outside of sort of the privileged circle. So you should never, forward emails or comment on information that's given to you in the legal advice arena. Any discussion or documentation received during a closed session. There again, many of the closed session exceptions to the open records law, there's some reason that the city says, it needs to have that information kept private. And so if people are then publicly discussing it out in the open, you sort of lose that argument. And it would, call into question whether the closed session was really necessary. Employment-related matters, including collective bargaining and disciplinary matters, those should always be kept confidential and not shared with others. And then the final one is sort of public speech. So under the Iowa Constitution and the Iowa Code, you are prohibited from spending public resources on political activities as a council member. So ballot measures, you're prohibited from advocating one way or the other on those. There are some exceptions for, speech that you make in your role as a private citizen, so that wouldn't come into play. And then also any officially adopted resolutions or proclamations that the council makes as a body regarding that type of matter is an exception. Okay, again, any questions before we move on?
What are the penalties if someone does the ex parte communications to both the individual or to the city?
So it could be a due process violation, like I talked about. In some circumstances, you could be talking a federal lawsuit because due process rights are under the federal constitution as well as the state constitution. There could be attorney fees involved. So, it can be a pretty significant challenge if somebody thinks the city has acted, unfairly against them. It would just depend on, what the claims are and what specifically happened. But anytime you're talking about constitutional violations, there's risks of litigation there. Okay, the last topic that I'm going to cover this evening is sort of an overview of the open meetings law. Open meetings is found in Chapter 21 of the Iowa Code. There is some language in the code that talks about the intent of the statute. The chapter seeks to assure through a requirement of open meetings of governmental bodies that the basis and rationale of governmental decisions, as well as those decisions themselves, are easily accessible to the people. Any ambiguity in the construction or application of the chapter should be resolved in favor of openness. So right off the bat, there is a presumption that openness is preferred, and closed meetings are sort of the exception. The law is to be liberally construed. Its purpose is to prohibit secret meetings and to require such meetings to be open and to allow the public to be present. So this comes from an Iowa Supreme Court case from 1991. So when we think about open meetings, the first question you always have to ask is, what is the meeting? So has a meeting occurred? Under the code, a meeting is considered a gathering in person or by electronic means, formal or informal, of a majority of the members of a governmental body where there is deliberation or action upon any matter within the scope of the governmental body's policy-making duties. So it has to be a gathering, majority of the members, and there has to be deliberation or action within their policy-making duties. Meetings do not include a gathering of members of a governmental body for purely ministerial or social purposes when there's no discussion of policy or no intent to avoid the purposes of this chapter. So the two questions that you always ask yourself is there a meeting, which we just went through that, and then is there a governmental body? For your purposes, a city council is a governmental body. That's well established. So if you have both of those, then the open meetings law is triggered and you have to follow the requirements under the open meetings law. So meetings of governmental bodies are required to be preceded by public notice. They have to be held in open session unless closed sessions are expressly permitted by the law, and all actions and discussions have to be conducted and executed in open session. Each governmental body is also required to keep minutes of all of its meetings. In terms of the notice requirements, the government has to give notice of the time, date, and place of each meeting and the tentative agenda of the meeting. The notice has to be given in a manner that's reasonably calculated to apprise the public of that information. The notice has to be posted on a bulletin board or other prominent place which is easily accessible to the public. And the notice must also be provided to news media who have requested such information. The notice has to be given at least 24 hours in advance of the meeting, unless for good cause such notice is impossible or impractical, and in that case, as much notice as is reasonably possible shall be given. As I said before, meetings are required to be held in open session unless a closed session is explicitly permitted. Section 21.5 of the Iowa Code lists 12 possible reasons for going into closed session. Nothing in the law requires a closed session. The council can always choose to remain in open session if it would like to. And any and all final action have to be taken in open session. The city council enters closed session by an affirmative vote of 2/3 of the members or by all members present at the meeting if it is less than that. The reason for holding the closed session by reference to the specific exemption under 21.5 has to be announced publicly and entered in the minutes. So you have to publicly state the reason why you are going into closed session before that occurs. These are some of the most common reasons for going into closed session. The first is to discuss litigation strategy with an attorney where litigation is pending or imminent. And where its disclosure would be likely to prejudice or disadvantage the position of the governmental body in that litigation. So there again, there's sort of the caveat that, well, the closed session is only allowed if we were to publicly talk about this, if it would be some disadvantage to the city. So if folks are going out and then, publicly talking about what was discussed in the closed session, you sort of lose that exception. Another one that we see pretty frequently is to evaluate the professional competency of someone whose appointment, hiring, performance, or discharge is being considered, but that can only be when it's necessary to prevent needless and irreparable injury to that individual's reputation and that individual requests a closed session. So when you're doing an annual evaluation of the city administrator or city attorney, as an example, that might be a reason for a closed session. Real estate is also another common one that we see. If the city is discussing the purchase or sale of real estate, where the premature disclosure could be reasonably expected to increase the price the government would have to pay for that property or reduce the price that you would receive for that property. That can be discussed in closed session. However, this exception has sort of a built-in qualifier that once that real estate transaction closes, then all that information has to be released publicly. Closed sessions must be recorded and minutes have to be taken. The minutes and the recording have to be retained for at least 1 year, except in the case of real estate. As I said, once that transaction closes, then that information has to be released, so that might be sooner than that. Minutes that are taken of council meetings have to show the time, date, place, and the members present at the meeting. Minutes are required to show the results of each vote taken. The minutes have to include sufficient information to indicate the vote of each member. All votes have to be made public in open session, so therefore voting by secret ballot is prohibited. This was an Iowa Supreme Court decision that came out in 2016, the Hutchison v. Scholl decision. This provided some additional guidance on the Open Meetings Code. And in that case, there was a possible open meetings violation where a county administrator had meetings with county supervisors individually to formulate a personnel restructuring plan. And basically the Supreme Court said that even though the meetings were with individuals, because it was sort of, what they talked about was communicated back and forth to come up with this plan, the court said that a meeting can occur where there is less than a majority of the body physically present, but where a majority is being represented by an agent or proxy. So the county administrator essentially was serving as an agent for all of the supervisors by going back and forth and sort of formulating this plan and getting their consent to all of it. So these can be referred to as serial.
I'll just interrupt for a moment. As a point of privilege, can we just have quiet in session?
So these sort of individual proxy meetings, I would say, can be referred to as serial meetings. So you should be very cautious even when you're meeting with less than a majority of the council. When you're talking about topics, you should not share what other board council members have said or how they plan to vote on things. Those types of small meetings should really just be information exchange and not sort of, formulating consensus or discussing policy specifically. So rules of conduct at meetings. The public is entitled to use camera or recording devices at open meetings. However, nothing in Chapter 21 prevents a governmental body from making and enforcing reasonable rules for the conduct of its meetings to assure that the meetings are orderly and free from interference or interruption by those in attendance. In terms of penalties for violations, damages can be assessed against all who participated in the meeting unless you can claim a valid defense. So personally, you could be assessed damages if you participate in a open meetings violation. Costs and reasonable attorney fees can also be paid either by those who participated in the meeting or if there's a valid defense, then by the government itself. And one of the defenses that is identified in the open meetings chapter is if you have a written legal opinion from an attorney saying, yes, I believe you're authorized to go into closed session to discuss this topic. So that is something to keep in mind where you might have a question about whether to go into a closed session or not. Actions that are taken by the body in violation of the law may be voided. So if you, were actually taking votes and that type of thing in closed session, that can be voided. You can actually be removed from office if there's been a prior violation, and the court can enter an injunction against further violations of the law. And finally, ignorance of the law is not a defense. So those were my prepared remarks. If anyone has questions.
All right, thank you. Looking at our time budget We would stay on track if we finish this part out at 6:15. So we have 15, 20 minutes to ask questions, have a discussion. This is an excellent time to do that. I certainly have a few questions of my own. I've been studying the mayor's duties and responsibilities and the administrator's responsibilities these last few weeks and months. One question I have is, it seems that in the mayor's powers and duties, there's some overlap with the administrator's powers and duties. And I'd specifically say, for me, I'm required to supervise departments and give direction, examine all functions in municipal departments, and the administrator has that same charge. So my question would be, have you seen this in other cities? Is an overlap common, or is this something that council should look at resolving and assigning these to one person or another?
I would say the overlap is not uncommon. Sometimes the mayor section of the city code was put in place before a city administrator was created in the code, and so sometimes that's where that overlap comes from. Sometimes it can be intentional, just because the mayor is sort of the chief officer of the council, and in certain circumstances, you may be called upon to make decisions that need to be made, right away. So there is a desire to give you some authority to be able to do that. And in the emergency context, certainly you need to be able to take control of the city and direct things to happen as they may need to occur. So I would say that is not unusual. Generally the day-to-day running of the city should be deferred to the administrator, just because that's his full-time role, that he's sort of closest to that. But it is not unusual that the mayor may be called to step in certain circumstances.
Okay, and then my second question, is just curious on the open meetings law. It lists social functions and ministerial functions as being a point where council members are allowed to meet together. What's a ministerial function?
I'm trying to think. Kevin, do you have a good example?
A grand opening or a ribbon cutting,
Right.
something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. So sort of a official function, but where you're not being called upon to take any action.
I'll give you another example. There was I believe a majority of P&Z members were here this evening.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't a meeting. They were just taking information.
Okay. Excellent. I'll open this up to council for questions, comments. Okay, this session, certainly it's being recorded now. I'm very glad that's the case. And we'll be using this for the other commissions and committees as well to review. And as we have questions, we'll bring them forward. And if necessary, we'll do a work session to discuss some of the details on it, because we received a lot of information today, but there certainly is going to be some particulars that we need to work through. So,
Also, Mr. Mayor, I have a copy if you or any council members would like a copy of the presentation. Make sure to make it available to you.
excellent.
Thank you very much.
And next on our agenda, we have the bus route restructuring discussion from Metropolitan Transit Director Mark Little.
Good evening. Guess we're going to have some extra time here tonight. Hi, my name is Mark Little. I am the General Manager of Met Transit in Waterloo. I have with me tonight Cody Leisman. He is our planner, and he is with Intercog here locally. What we want to do tonight is give you a brief overview of the Met services that we currently provide, and then services that we may be proposing for this year or maybe the year after or down the road. Just a little overview of Met. Met is governed by a board of trustees. There's 9 trustees appointed from the city of Waterloo and 4 from Cedar Falls, and that's based on the hours of service and the funding from each city. We operate both fixed route service, which is your traditional bus service that you see running around with the bigger buses, and also a paratransit service, which is door-to-door for persons with disabilities and the elderly. Operate on about a $5 million budget each year. Slightly goes up and down as things change. We have submitted, I think about a month ago, a funding request for FY21. Not sure if you've received a copy of that, but it is requesting a 3% increase from FY20. Reason for that is normal ups and downs, insurance cost, employee cost, Fuel, we're seeing diesel cost on the rise again. So we tried to keep that as low as possible, but we did submit a 3% increase. Now, Met is funded by a variety of different sources. We're funded by the City of Waterloo through a transit levy, Cedar Falls through a transit levy. The state gives a little bit, about $350,000 on a $5 million budget, and the federal government, and then the rest is made up with fares, contracts, et cetera. So that's an overview of the Met service we operate now. Well, on the fixed route, you might be thinking on the ridership. The fixed route, we provide about 375,000 rides on our regular bus system and about 60,000 rides on our paratransit. Again, paratransit is a very, very important service. It's for persons with disabilities, the elderly, that cannot ride the regular bus system. Of those 60 or 55,000, about 20,000 last year either started or ended in Cedar Falls here. So you had 20,000 rides either start, the rest either started in Waterloo, ended in Waterloo, and then we provide a little bit of service out in Evansdale for that. What I'd like to do is introduce Cody here, and Cody actually has a PowerPoint to talk about a little bit about what we've been doing lately. We identified probably a year ago a need to take a look at our whole system, the fixed route system, and see if there's any changes that can be made and still stay within our current budget, just making those changes. We do have options for both cities. We have an option for Waterloo to add service, and we have an option for Cedar Falls. I'm not sure if it'll work for this budget year or maybe the following year. We have had, I've been with Met for over 39 years. I've never seen a time that there has been so much request for additional transit service, whether it be in the downtown areas, the areas that are outlying areas a little bit, in Cedar Falls, particularly the industrial park, the Walmart area, and in Waterloo, the north part of Waterloo. So we feel it's our responsibility to respond to that, at least let the cities know that this is what we're hearing, and identify some types of solutions. So I'm going to turn it over to Cody now, and he'll go ahead and start his presentation on that. Thanks, Cody.
Thank you, Mark. And good evening, everybody. Happy New Year. My name is Cody Leisman. I'm a transportation planner with INTRCOG. That's the Iowa Northland Regional Council of Governments, and we're in Waterloo, Iowa. I've been tasked with working with Met Transit to help develop the new restructured bus routes for both Waterloo and Cedar Falls. And so, like Mark said, I prepared a PowerPoint, and I'm going to start very high level, very basic, just so everyone's on the same page. What is transit? Why, how does Cedar Falls fit in with this larger restructuring we're doing? And then from there, I'll show you sort of a general concept of what we're proposing. Nothing is official, nothing's drafted. And then at that point, with whatever time is left, maybe 10 minutes or so, we can do a little Q&A. But I kindly just ask that you hold your questions, because I'm sure there may be several questions after the presentation, and we'll go from there. So a very basic question: why provide public transportation at all? I think there are several reasons why a city provides public transportation, but regardless of your viewpoint, I think there are at least two that should compel you. And the first is simply to provide transportation for people with no other options, people who can't drive because of a disability, people who don't have the means to afford an automobile, people who can't drive due to age or other reasons. And then second, to help people escape poverty. We think of people who ride the bus are often people with low incomes, but not only does a bus provide transportation for people with low incomes, but can also serve to get them the economic opportunity, the employment, to help get them out of their situation. So I'll touch on both of those here real quick. First, people with disabilities. All the Met buses are wheelchair accessible. That is different than, say, taxis or ride-sharing services that do not have that. Not only are they wheelchair accessible, but the passenger doesn't need to get out of their wheelchair. And so that is a major benefit that helps them live independently, that gives them mobility and transportation with dignity as well. Now, compared to the paratransit system, which is a demand response, you call up Met Transit and they can get you a paratransit bus. The cost of running a fixed bus route is cheaper, both for Met Transit, and so in turn for the city, but as well as for the passenger too. I don't know the exact figures, but I think the fixed route, well, I know fixed route is $1.50 per ride. I'm not sure what the cost is to the user, $3 per ride. And then the cost of operating is at least 3 times higher than the cost of operating fixed route per ride. So another reason to consider that. Access to employment. Now, this goes both ways. Of course, like I said before, having a reliable bus system allows people to access those jobs, to get to work, to get home, and to their other destinations. But in reverse, there was a survey conducted by Cedar Valley in 2017, the Industry Insights Survey, and they asked manufacturers throughout the Cedar Valley, Blackhawk County, but also for the surrounding counties, about a variety of different variables that relate to their business. And public transit was identified as a top need, actually the lowest scoring service on that survey. And so then they approached Intercog afterward, and we went and we did a survey of businesses along Airline Highway as sort of a follow-up to that. But with workforce being a top need for employers, not only for employees, but employers, that's another reason to have the bus. It's cheaper, obviously, than the cost of owning and maintaining an automobile. This is a figure I like to show. It's from Edmunds' True Cost to Own calculator. You think of the cost of buying a vehicle, you may think of the gas, but the depreciation and a lot of other costs really add up for people. And so when you factor all those in, spanned over a 5-year span of time, the cost of riding a bus is substantially lower, whereas maintaining even just a basic level of reliable personal transportation, in this case a 6-year-old economy car, is 8 times greater than the cost of a monthly bus pass. And I think one of the biggest points to take away from this, at least these first few slides, is that a good bus system has reliable schedules. And so in contrast to, say, a ride-sharing service, again, where you need to book a ride, if you're trying to get to work every morning, you'd have to likely book a ride every morning. And then the second and third bullet points, the buses are larger and they're predictable. And so if you have a dozen people who need to get to work at 8 in the morning, are there a dozen Ubers ready to go? Probably not. I'm not sure how many of you use ride sharing, but I know that when I've looked, there's only a couple drivers typically. And so this allows you to leave your house at a predictable time, get on the bus, get to work or wherever you need to go, and all of it's on schedule rather than on demand. So that was the overview spiel. Now I'm going to go a little bit into more detail with the fixed routes in Cedar Falls specifically. So you have 3 bus routes total, 3 fixed route bus routes in Cedar Falls, and I'm combining routes 6 and 7 because they follow the same route, which is University Avenue, and then by UNI downtown, and then Rainbow Drive, and then Route 7 operates in reverse. That's a route that's split between the city of Cedar Falls and the city of Waterloo, the local share. Route 9 is the only route that the city of Cedar Falls pays for entirely, or pays the local share entirely. So this is the one route that you control 100%, and it's known as the Cedar Falls Loop. And as you can see, it is a large loop that goes to UNI in both directions and covers the northernmost and southernmost parts of the city. Lastly, Route 11, this one's actually, the local share is funded by the University of Iowa student government. The Panther Shuttle runs every 35 minutes, and it gets to the various off-campus apartments that are near campus and brings those students to and from class. Typically, you see the highest ridership in the cold winter months, January, February, March, when students don't want to walk or drive. And so I'll give you a quick example of someone who might ride the bus in Cedar Falls. We'll in this case, use an example of a resident at Thunder Ridge or in the Thunder Ridge neighborhood that wants to get to the Cedar Falls Public Library. The specifics of this example aren't as important as the general takeaway. So in this case, a passenger who wants to get on the bus would get on at 10 after, so we'll say 12:10, and they would take the bus, and it goes right downtown, gets them to the library at 12:20, about 10 minutes, real quick. Probably can't go much faster than that. The issue is that if the same person wants to get back home, in order to get home using the Cedar Falls Loop or any bus route, since the only route is the Route 9, they would need to do the following. That would take them down to Viking Road, then to Ridgeway, up Hudson, back to UNI. And it takes a while. It takes about an hour. Altogether, both directions would take an hour. So 10 minutes there, 50 minutes back. This here is just a draft. It's just for illustrative purposes to show you first what we're considering doing in Cedar Falls and what we've already set in motion to do in Waterloo, which is to take a lot of those loop routes and make them two-directional. This is how most cities do have their bus routes, at least most larger cities. So then the same person, same origin and destination, leaving at the same time, could get downtown about 10 minutes, maybe even quicker, just depends how long the bus takes for making stops. And then the return would be the same way. You see a little loop through downtown, you'd see a little loop in the other end too, but that makes it only 8 minutes each direction, a total of 16 minutes. So a very substantial savings in time. And what we know, so Intercog did a survey a while back where they surveyed Met Transit passengers and they asked people to get from your home to your work, how long are you willing to ride the bus before you opt to use some other mode of transportation? Overwhelmingly, people said that they have no problem riding the bus for 10 minutes. Even 15 minutes is not a big deal. Once you start to get past 30 minutes, it drops off significantly. And so using that first example of the person living in Thunder Ridge needing to ride the bus 50 minutes to get back to their home, very, very few people are willing to make that trip. But most people would be fine with riding it for 8 to 10 minutes. And so what I'm trying to show with this is that I expect that you would see ridership increase. I wouldn't hesitate that with some kind of restructuring like what I just showed, Cedar Falls could see its ridership double, possibly even triple, just because there are so many people right now whose routes would be in that 50-minute range, or 40 to 50 minutes. So that's the broad overview, that's the presentation. Ultimately, we're not making any recommendation this year, this budget cycle, but we may be back next year to propose something like what I showed you that would improve transit service. But right now, we're recommending no changes. So with that concludes my presentation, and Mark and I are available now if there are any questions.
I'll open it to council for any questions. I have one for that route that you had suggested from Thunder Ridge to downtown.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be potentially a change of dropping service somewhere else? Because I noticed then you wouldn't have necessarily the UNI route, or is that still way in the discussions?
At this point, everything is up for discussion, and I would open that up to Mark too. But the recommendation would be to add a whole nother route. Now, using that example, and I emphasize it is just an example, it's hard to make two equal one. So it's hard to take a loop and the coverage you get with a loop and have the exact same coverage with a single route that's going in both directions. So there might be some trade-offs. I mean, there will be some trade-offs, but that's for the city and Met Transit with the help of Intercog to help sort through that and figure out the best service for the citizens.
And then my second question was, looking at the fee costs, I think it was 2001 was the last time the fees were increased, and they're at $1.50 now. Have there been discussions about potentially increasing that to account for cost of living?
We raised the fees in 2001, and at that time, we were significantly higher than anyone in the state. The average in the state right now is about $1.50, and that's where we're at now. About 11% of our budget is made up of fares, so even if you increased a quarter, if you figure that out on a $5 million budget, it doesn't really mean a lot. But that's something our board has considered and continually looks at. I do want to address that back up on this coverage. It is a trade-off. If you stay within the same number of hours you're operating now and improve efficiency, the trade-off is that some areas in Cedar Falls may not have service. What we've done is we've identified areas where there's real low ridership. We're doing the same thing in Waterloo. We just have to go where the riders are and market that area there within the limited budget that we have. So sitting here, I thought to myself, when someone asked, well, why haven't we done this sooner? If it's more efficient, well, that's the issue, is we tried to cover too much within both cities. And although there's good coverage throughout both communities, it comes at a cost, and that's the efficiency part.
Thank you. And I would just encourage council members. I've learned a lot by doing Met Transit rides over the last 4 years, and especially being able to interact with the riders and hear some of their stories. Would encourage any public policymakers or staff to take a trip on and meet some of the folks, especially for council, that are in your wards. Yes, Councilor DePere.
In our packet, there was a chart here on Bus 9, and I was curious. It looked like the ridership from 2014 to 2019 was about 50%. Do we have ideas as to why it's down that much? Is it because of adding that Panther shuttle, or?
No, it went down, and I think I do have that here. It went down, I think, in 2014. That's when we went from all-day service to half-day service. We cut the middle out. So obviously, when there's less hours of service on a route, you're going to have less rides. What we look for is the rides per hour as the efficiency, and that has remained the same. And in fact, we're seeing a slight increase now in ridership on Route 9, now that we're back to the all-day service that you guys approved last year. We lost a lot of, I think our peak at one time was 26,000 rides on that route. And
Yeah, I see 26,000 down to about 12,000, or
Yeah.
12,009.
we lost a lot of rides when we dropped that. That was back when we lost that, Frank, and you may remember, we lost that JARC route. The JARC funding from the federal government, they just did away with the program. And then we had to reduce the hours on that route to just AM and PM hours and no midday service. And that's where the ridership really dropped, and then it's starting to come back now that you've added that back in.
Councilor Cruz.
I'm curious if we know that there's such a time length in returning from the downtown, why are we postponing doing any route changing for quite a while here, it looks to me? Wouldn't we update these things monthly sometimes? Or, I mean, there's funding to change probably, but if you see something glaring like this, wouldn't we want to fix it within the next 3-4 months, 6 months?
We have an additional route proposed. It's, Stephanie, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. We've had a couple conversations with Met Transit and with Intercog here as they've been talking about different options. They start to range a lot in the costs, and that concerned us, not really knowing what would be the best route yet, that there's still some public outreach they want to do, talking with the drivers and that type of thing. We just thought with costs ranging anywhere from $150,000 to $250,000 for additional routes, we should get some better information before we're making a recommendation.
But on that, we do identify changes, and we have made minor route changes. The problem here in Cedar Falls, what we see is all the rides are spread out. And if you remember, I think 2 years ago during the budget, we had a lot of folks here from the Ridgeway area, the trailer court out there by the roundabout. Now, we only might get 5 or 6 people out there a whole day, but they have no other transportation. So we have to go out there, which is the far southern end of the route, and there's just pockets all over. But we have made minor changes to the route to help people who better get to it.
It would seem that you could possibly do smaller loops and circles so that people can jump from one area of town to another. You know, in the case that you gave there with somebody from Thunder Ridge to downtown, they certainly don't need to go sightseeing in the rest of town to get back home. Are you following what I'm saying?
Yeah, I agree.
And it just seems to take, you're implying 1.5 years to fix that. Is that what I'm seeing here?
We have a proposal, but we have an additional route that we could add now that would improve that efficiency. I'm just not sure that in discussions with staff, if the city was willing to take that on for this next fiscal year.
So we're in fiscal year '20, and '21 starts July 1st. So July 1st of '21 is when you're speaking of changing.
Well, that would be the next, if we go through the next budget cycle, we could have something, and we do have a route that we could implement July 1st of next year.
Your fiscal year is the same as the city's. Okay.
Counselor Harding.
I do want to say on that too, the cost on that route, and that's correct what Stephanie said. What we do, the cost to operate a fixed route, just 1 hour of service with everything in it, is about $78 per hour. It's very, very expensive. Cedar Falls cost and Waterloo's cost, we get it down to about $42 an hour, and that's based on using federal funds, state funds, fares, and everything else we can put into it. It's expensive.
Counselor Harding.
Is there a way that if they have the information that we could possibly do something sooner? We could have a work session, get more information, possibly implement something so we don't have to wait a year and a half to, if they have a solution and they feel like we can up ridership and help people, I don't see why we couldn't look at it sooner.
Director Sheets.
Sure, that's just something that we'd have to anticipate in the budget, and that would be a proposal that would come forward through the budgeting process. Just looking back at the proposal for an additional route, it was almost $150,000 to add to the budget, which we were concerned that that's a fairly significant increase in the Met Transit levy, and thought that since we still didn't have all the information that was still processed yet to go through in terms of consulting with people, the other part of it was that we have reached out to UNI student government to talk about the Panther shuttle and whether there might be opportunities to collaborate with what they put into the cost there in order to both maximize service a little bit better and both see benefits on that overall cost. So we just felt that the solution is kind of half-baked at this point, if you will, and so we weren't comfortable making a recommendation to make that kind of increase when we just didn't have all the information together yet. We're hoping that over the next 6 months or so that we're able to get that, and that August-September timeframe we'd be able to have a better proposal for council so that we would be ready to talk about this with the next budget.
Do we have an idea
Wait,
what's...
please.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Counselor Miller.
In terms of ridership, and I believe this came up in 14 too, the North Cedar area doesn't have a loop or isn't connected at all. How do you gauge whether there's people that want to ride or not? Is that just based off people that call, or?
Well, we've had service out there off and on
Sure.
several years, and it's never really produced. And it's my understanding from the board members who represent Cedar Falls that the house ownership, whatever you call it, is down out there anyway from what it was years ago. We didn't have ridership before. We haven't had a lot of requests from that area. Sure. We looked at providing service out there. I think it's an area that it's worth a try.
Sure.
But to keep within one extra route, it would be at the sacrifice of some other area where we think there'd be pretty good ridership.
Sure.
Yeah.
The finite budget really is what this all boils down to,
Absolutely.
essentially, which, just a comment in general, continually we're pushing for walkable, bikeable neighborhoods, and public transit could be a huge part of that. And I hope we consider additional routes or other options if and when the time comes here. So,
Counselor Cruz, did you have a question? Or?
I guess it's along the lines of Mr. Miller's comment of knowing how many more riders we could pick up if you did a smaller loop, like you described in the example there. Do you have a grasp on that, a way to, from years past, to know what there could be?
In years past, in Cedar Falls, it's difficult. We have more service in Waterloo just based on the area. We have seen ridership when an additional route usually adds about 8% the first year. That's low, I think, and it all depends on what area, or if you're either adding more coverage or more frequency. It's hard to say. It all depends on, I think, the area that you're looking at. And again, I think the shift has been over the years to efficiency. Nobody wants to ride the bus 45 minutes no more, and they used to do that. So with this type of service here, with the efficiency, it is something new to our area. So it's hard to speculate, but I'd guess around 8% the first year.
So I guess along that lines, my thought is, do we have good numbers of the population having or not having vehicles? And
Yes. COG has that information. I don't have that with me tonight.
I'm just kind of curious if...
Yes.
through census data, that sort of thing?
We can get that to you. We have that. Intercog has that information.
And one other point I'd add, just regarding ridership too, just going back to that one graph I had up, you could have a new route that does a great job at attracting new riders and a new route that does a terrible job. It does depend on the route and the commute times. So again, if you have a route that, for instance, can get people from downtown down to Viking Road in 10 to 15 minutes, you're going to have a lot more riders who are going to do that than if it's still going to take them 45, 50 minutes. And so it does depend on the details and the technicals of that.
And when I said we've done that in Waterloo, Cedar Falls is different because the two buses that you pay for is between Waterloo and Cedar Falls. It just goes back and forth. There's the most logical way is Rainbow Drive and University. So that takes care of those two. Route 9, we're trying to cover everything in Cedar Falls with that, all the way from the southern part to the northern part. So again, I think by making some changes, it's difficult. We still want to cover basically the same area with just reducing some in areas that are not producing the ridership now.
Thank you.
Is there discussion on the size of the vehicles? Lean
We
and
have.
mean, just like,
We made that change already, I think, on your downtown shuttle that you have on Thursday and Friday and Saturday nights. We've went to a smaller vehicle, a little bit cheaper to operate. Your cost is really in your operator wages, benefits. Miles per gallon is probably about 3 miles difference. But we have done that. We've done that actually in the downtown Cedar Falls and the UNI Panther shuttle. We reduced that bus size to give them a little bit better cost.
Excellent, thank you. Anything else? Counselor Sires?
Are you guys a private business?
No, we're actually an agency that's created by two cities, Waterloo and Cedar Falls, through a 2080 agreement. That actually came together in 1973. So with that, we're not a city department, but we're an agency created by two cities, and we have a board that we report to, appointed by both cities.
Excellent.
We are the federal recipient of all transit funds, public transit funds for this area, for the urban area. Intercog has the rural areas.
Okay, thank you.
Counselor Miller?
For staff, in terms of increasing the budget here, the transit levy, I believe, is what we currently use for this. How does that work? If we were to increase the funding for it, where does that need to come from?
So it would come from our transit levy, which obviously equates to a property tax increase. I think one of the things that staff was, again, concerned about is, right now I think the levies would be sitting at 420,000 or something close to that. And, 150,000 is a pretty significant percentage increase over the 420. But one of the things that it sounded like there was some concern about, if we don't do it now, we can't do it again until July 1st of 21. If in 6 months Met comes back and the council is interested, in doing something, that doesn't mean we can't look at doing a budget amendment and doing it sooner. Now, I don't want to promise that, and I don't want to, but that is something that could happen. I don't want you to think just because you missed this budget cycle, you would have to wait another whole year to do that. So that could be another option. Because again, I think there was a lot of pieces staff was still wanting to make sure we had solid before we, really agreed to do that or brought a proposal here.
Are we able to use other funding sources as well as the transit levy? Or are we limited? in
Well,
some regard?
we could use our general fund to do that. I think for us, we've always felt like, why would we do that? If there's something that's outside the 810, why do we want to use our $8.10 capacity when there's a transit
Sure.
levy to do that? So again, if we did do something that was, in the middle of the year, probably what would happen is we would probably cash flow it and then add it to our 22 budget transit levy is what, when I said about doing a budget amendment, but that's what we would have to do.
There is a cap on the transit levy mandated by the state, but neither city is near that.
No.
So there's room.
If I may.
Continue.
This is one of those philosophical things, I don't think anybody wants to see a tax increase for anybody, but what are we going to be for in this community? And I think this is one of those things that we need to question. That can people get to work in Cedar Falls, Iowa? Can people do something other than drive a car, which we're pushing for that in so many other ways? University Avenue with any mode of transportation. So I hope we consider it.
And I would like to add to Councilman Cruz, kind of on your question, we would, in the first year, we would still evaluate that route. And we can make changes in between. We're not going to wait a whole year to make any changes to any route. If we see an area that's not producing, we'll survey that area first, and then we'll look to make changes. But we're not just going to throw a route out there and not make any changes. We can make them at any time during the year.
And I'll just make a point, too, that that has been part of some of this, at least the 2119 College Street project, when that came forward. One of the advantages or benefits they were saying, well, the reason they wouldn't need as much parking is because public transit would be available to service those areas. So I think that is something we do have to consider as we're looking at site plans as well. Any other, Councilor Gibbs?
Along the lines that you were describing there, evaluating routes, your Thunder Ridge to downtown route, if you were to go across the bridge to North Cedar to a collector point, and maybe not every half hour, maybe hourly or something, or in morning and the evening for workers, potential, that sort of evaluation.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, that's what I wouldn't mind seeing.
Yeah, a good example would be during the peak hours,
Sure.
which would be the morning, and then maybe not in the midday, but then in the afternoon for
Maybe
the
once
workers
at
out
noon
there.
or something, or
Absolutely,
whatever.
yeah, we would certainly take a look at that, because I know the industrial park may be growing out there, and we'd have to keep an eye on that area, too. We used to do a lot of service on Airline Highway. That's just changed a lot out there, so.
Councilor Dare?
I guess, hearing this discussion, I would suggest that sometime in the next couple months, we set aside a work session and get these guys over and talk to staff about how do we move forward on this. It's obviously something that's needed and quite a bit of interest, so just a thought.
We'd be glad to. Yep.
Okay, anything else?
I
Councilor
have
Myers?
one more thing. That's 12,000 rides it's down to. You said you talked about 12,000 rides in a year.
If that's, I don't have that information with me, what it was for last year. I know at its peak, it was 26,000.
Almost 13,000.
So if
Almost
it's
13.
13,000, if we paid $10 a ride, that's 130,000.
Right.
And that's getting no other money from anyone else. That's just the city paying for it, so we'd be cheaper off to have something like Uber or something, pick people up, run them straight down, straight here, straight back, and save the federal government and everybody else money.
Well, you would
That's not
have
true?
that, yeah, you could do that. Something that really hasn't been mentioned with this is we also have paratransit service that you get with that. Very important service. I've always been an advocate of paratransit. These folks have no other way of getting anywhere. So that's door-to-door service that you get with that. You pay a little bit, but you pay a lot less than what you do for a fixed route. I don't know of any Uber, well, there might be. I haven't seen an Uber that's accessible for a person with disabilities, and all of our buses are. But getting back to that cost, you're correct. I think that was discussed a few years back about cabs or something.
So if we're throwing out $240,000 now and then using all the extra tax money, we could do a better job by having a door-to-door service and then having it have a wheelchair lift.
Cedar Falls could do a better job? Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, anything else? Councilor Miller?
I think the other part of that conversation is the consistency of it for our residents, in that they can provide, the consistency to get to work and everything else comparatively with an Uber and I believe that came up in 14 as well when this conversation happened, as far as a private company taking this over, and I think it's been crickets as far as I've heard anyway since then. So just pointing it out.
Councilor Cruz?
If there's a known number of the population that needs the handicap accessible vehicle, then I would think if the demand is there, the Uber will arrive, or somebody will come forth with private vehicles.
It's very expensive. I mean, they may. You see that in the Medicaid transportation. There have been private companies jump into that, but with the fluctuation of Medicaid funds, some have left too because they couldn't afford to stay in business. It's expensive.
Well, there's people that do dialysis
We do a lot
a
of
couple
dialysis.
times, yeah.
Yep.
So,
Okay. Councilor Harding?
I think the consistency is, I agree, a large portion. If you have, 30 people that call out to get to work in the morning, then you need 30 Ubers, or they're going to be late. So, but ultimately, I agree, Council. We need to have a work session, I think, and talk about, because I'm all for getting people, funding and helping out to get people to work. But I think it'd be best to set a work session personally.
We'd be glad to do that.
Okay. Thank you. No other comments? We will close this out. Thank you so much to
Thank you.
Director Little and Mr. Leisman for all your work, and we'll look forward to seeing you again. Next item on the agenda is our bills and payroll. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
With all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries.
And for the record, there are 2 payrolls.
Thank you. And so with that, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All those in favor, or I guess no favors, so we are adjourned until our 7 o'clock meeting.